What if Earth wasn't invaded for power, territory, or vengeance, but for its water? From the edge of a dying galaxy, an alien fleet has crossed the void, not to speak, not to trade, but to harvest the only resource they believe still matters. They've found our oceans. They've mapped our skies, and now they're coming to drain us dry. But humanity does not kneel, not in the dark, not at the edge of extinction. Outnumbered, outgunned, and without warning, we send our warships into the frozen outer reaches of the solar system to fight not just for survival, but for meaning, for memory, and for every drop on Earth we still call home. Join us as we journey into the cold, dark beyond the planets to witness the day Earth answered with fire. Section 1. Echoes in the Infrared. From the outermost spiral arms of a galaxy so distant its light had never brushed Earth's atmosphere, a species known only as the Velar Dominion tracked the void like cartographers mapping despair, their instruments tuned not to stars or sound, but to moisture, the breath of worlds, the condensation of gravity, the chemical echo of oceans born and dying across epochs. Their home system, once wrapped in glacial rings and flowing equatorial rivers, had long since collapsed into a scorched lattice of rusted plateaus and brine-choked basins, its core water sources strip-mined into extinction by generations of miscalculated growth and climate arrogance. What remained was not civilization, but strategy. Hovering in the upper magnetic veil of a brown dwarf near the galactic fringe, a Velar reconnaissance arc deployed its final probe. An ancient array of gravitational and spectral lenses chained together in a formation that spanned nearly half the length of the moon. It took 6 cycles to stabilize, and another 8 to triangulate anything worthwhile, but when the signal came, faint, unassuming, cradled in the CMB static like a whisper too old to remember, it brought the Ark's commander, a being named Varsolvinek, to silence so complete that even the navigational subroutines paused mid-function. There, nestled in the blue-shifted infrared, was Earth. Its albedo suggested cloud systems in motion, reflective zones consistent with polar ice caps, and layered signatures indicative of high-volume liquid oceans not only present, but stable across hemispheres. More than water, it was balance. It was equilibrium. It was everything the Velar no longer had and could never recreate. Tvar rotated his thought cluster through the transmission arrays, opening diplomatic cipher layers not to initiate contact, but to issue classification. Resource viable. A world deemed valuable not for its culture, nor its signals, nor its primitive orbital infrastructure, but for the simple, unignorable fact that it contained what the Velar called the breath of time. In Velar's symbology, water was not just element. It was history, function, and inheritance. It was survival. He issued one final pulse toward the Dominion's central archive. 2 words, encoded in recursive syntax and overlaid with urgency qualifiers. Harvest directive. Far across the vacuum, a fleet stirred. Long slumbering arcs rising from hibernation beneath icy exoplanet rings, swarmcraft awakening from within gas giant mantles, and carriers the length of tectonic plates spinning up their singularity drives. The Velar had waited nearly 1,000 Earth years to find another reservoir. They would not wait again. Meanwhile, at the edge of the solar system, nestled inside a relay buoy half forgotten by its creators and nearly buried beneath comet trails, Earth's automated sentinel known as Janus stirred to life. Its AI, long since bored by the silence of deep time, caught a ripple, an odd signature in the gravitational substrata, too rhythmic for natural origin, too heavy for cometary drag, and far too coordinated to be dismissed. Inside Janus's core array, a decision protocol fired. The AI did not know what it had detected, but it knew this. It was incoming. It was not human, and it would arrive faster than anyone was ready for. Earth was no longer alone in the sky. and somewhere far beyond the heliosphere, something was coming. Not to learn, not to trade, not to speak, but to take. Please do press that like button if you have enjoyed this story so far. That would mean a lot to me. Now back to the story. Section 2. The signal no one wanted to hear. In a chamber buried 6 kilometers beneath the Australian desert, where basalt strata formed a natural Faraday cradle for the planet's most sensitive threat detection array, an alert cascade flashed silently across a console that had not activated in 37 years. No klaxons sounded, no sirens rose, only a pulse of deep blue light crawling across the room's perimeter like a rising tide. The Janus Sentinel had relayed its findings across the Q-burst backbone with urgency protocols flagged, not for human review, but for AI consensus, and the consensus was immediate. Event trajectory matched 0 known celestial or artificial object classifications. A cluster of quantum learning threat evaluators, housed in what the Defense Corps called the Orchard, modeled the waveform 3 million times in under a second. They traced gravitational fluctuations, inferred vessel mass from wake turbulence, and estimated the point of origin based on relativistic blue shift across the burst profile. The conclusion was so specific and so damning that it caused the primary model supervisor to pause mid-simulation and output a single human-readable phrase: intergalactic incursion detected. Oort Cloud entry projected in 31 days. High above the Earth, in the geosynchronous orbital cradle where the United Terran Assembly maintained its secure command relay hub, Chairwoman Els Tren used a retinal override to bypass diplomatic protocols and activate the one command block she had trained for but hoped never to use. Her voice, steady but thick with the weight of history, spoke 3 words into a vacuum that would carry them across every defense grid, orbital platform, and deep space military command post-Earth had ever built: Protocol Orbital Line. It was a name drawn from the ancient trench maps of Earth's long-forgotten surface wars, but its meaning had evolved. It no longer referred to a position of static defense. It now invoked the deployment of humanity's most advanced, decentralized, and unsanctioned defensive force, an array of deep space interceptor squadrons, autonomous orbital weapons platforms, and command-optional warships stationed in the solar system's farthest reaches, far beyond civilian knowledge. It was not designed to protect Earth in its entirety, but to bleed anything that dared to cross the void. At the same moment, across 32 shipyards, 79 black sites, and every moon-based observation post in the system, alert signals transmitted in compressed data bursts embedded in innocuous weather reports. Submerged submarines in Europa's oceans stirred their long idle engines. Solar harvester relays above Mercury realigned to boost ComNet priority beams, and hidden beneath the crust of Pluto's icy plains, the hull of Namaka's Rage, a vessel no human civilian had ever seen, shivered as her nuclear spine surged back to life. Earth's military command, still recovering from decades of peacetime decentralization, scrambled to re-establish fleet-wide encryption. Meanwhile, diplomats debated whether to signal the unknown intruders or remain silent and prepare to strike first. But the deeper problem wasn't what the Velari might want. It was the clarity of their trajectory. Every projected vector, every burn curve and gravitational slingshot aligned with Earth's orbit around Sol, not in a theoretical sense, but with surgical exactness. This was not exploration. This was targeting. By the end of the first 24 hours, simulations confirmed the full scope. 26 foreign vessels, each exceeding half the mass of the International Lunar Ring, were closing on the outer edge of the Oort Cloud with an acceleration pattern indicative of controlled singularity drives, technology decades ahead of humanity's best projections. The civilian world remained unaware, but the sky had already shifted. And in the silence of deep space, the oldest question humanity had ever asked returned with a terrible answer. Not just are we alone, but what happens when we're not? And that answer was coming with thirst, precision, and no hesitation. If you have enjoyed this story so far, then please do subscribe and hit the bell icon to listen to more stories like this one. Let's get back to the story now. Section 3. Waterworld's Curse. In the subterranean depths of the Mars-based think tank complex, buried beneath Olympus Mons like an artery of cognition winding through iron-rich stone, the world's most advanced human minds gathered in a sealed amphitheater, its walls humming with magnetic shielding and ambient interference suppression. Physicists, exobiologists, hydrospheric modelers, and astrostrategists stared up at the translucent curve of the projection dome, where the approaching alien fleet shimmered like a string of blood cells flowing through the vascular edge of the solar system. They had only just begun to understand the implications, and already the unease had metastasized into dread. The vessels moved not with the erratic momentum of explorers or surveyors, but with the unity of organisms evolved for consumption. Layered formations that absorbed sunlight like photonic predators, with deep interior signatures indicating industrial-grade atmosphere processors and hydration extractors primed for planetary-scale operation. And when linguistic AIs finally cracked a fragment of intercepted velar telemetry, the translation sent a shiver through the room more profound than any battle map or weapon schematic. They had referred to Earth not as a planet, nor a species, nor even a target. They had called it the uncapped reservoir. For the Velari, water was not simply utility, it was fate. Their evolution, driven by eons of adaptive biology shaped by scarcity and oceanic drift, had forged a culture where moisture was heritage and every drop of atmospheric vapor was a sacrament. To them, humanity's biosphere represented not just a solution to extinction, but a betrayal of galactic order. Earth, in their view, was a selfish outlier. A world where liquid was wasted on non-symbiotic life forms, unregulated climate cycles, and open-air evaporation. Worse still, the Velar interpreted Earth's silence, its lack of interstellar diplomacy, its absence from the galactic resource packs, its refusal to share or even acknowledge its abundance as hoarding. The think tank fell into a heavy stillness as they processed the unfiltered truth. The Velari did not see humans as cruel or warlike or even inferior. They saw them as inefficient gatekeepers of an inheritance too sacred to be left to chaos. As Earth's oceans were mapped, cataloged, and quantified in real time by the alien fleet's sensor webs, a moral question began to fracture the edges of the war room's unified resolve. Philosophers and ethicists, summoned at the last minute and seated far from the Admiralty benches, began murmuring among themselves. Was it truly defensible to guard a surplus when another civilization faced extinction? Could compassion be weaponized into weakness? Was refusal to share water, not knowledge, not power, but water, an act of violence by omission? Yet those voices were nearly drowned by another truth, one captured in the eyes of every scientist, soldier, and engineer staring at the incoming fleet's trajectory. If they reached Earth orbit, they would not ask. They would not negotiate. They would drain the clouds, strip the oceans, melt the polar caps, and leave a brittle husk spinning in solar gravity, not out of cruelty, but out of pure, unsentimental necessity. Back on Earth, Chairwoman Tren held a global address under the veil of a classified briefing. Her message, though never aired to the public, was recorded for posterity. She said, "This is the burden of abundance, that what we have will someday be seen as unfair, that our existence may one day be the solution to another species' extinction, and that they may not care whether we survive that trade." She ended the speech with a line that would later be etched onto the hull of the Caspian crown. "We are the stewards of what we did not earn, and that means we must defend it like it matters to someone else." From that moment forward, Earth was no longer just home. It was heritage, and the question no longer was whether to resist, but how. Section 4. Into the Oort. At the edge of sunlight's reach, where the gravitational grasp of Sol grew tenuous and the cold became less a sensation and more a presence, the Oort Cloud stretched like a myth, an ancient halo of ice and rock and forgotten fragments drifting through silence older than language. It was here in this outer wilderness that humanity made its stand, not from arrogance or vengeance or conquest, but from a deep, solemn recognition that to defend Earth was to define what it meant to belong to it. The ships of the Argo Shield Line emerged not in formation, but in constellation. Each warcraft massed within overlapping fields of optical camouflage and magnetic distortion, their trajectories guided by quantum gravimeters so precise they could weave between planetoids without disturbing their millennia-old drift. Among them sailed the Helios Fall, its silhouette sharp and narrow like a blade forged in orbit, its hull a living composite that flexed with temperature changes and particle density. Nearby, the Namaka's Rage, a vessel half battleship, half cryogenic processing station, drifted beneath the reflective shell of a comet's trailing shadow, her railguns folded into the hull like muscles at rest. No engine glow marked her movement. No signal betrayed her presence. She was silence weaponized, anticipation given form. And flanking them both was the Caspian Crown, a ship once built as a diplomatic ark, now retrofitted for defense. Its fusion lattice reinforced with graphene-threaded armor, its communication relays capable of transmitting entire languages in less than a second. Though she carried armaments, her true function was more dangerous. She would be first to speak. Inside her command deck, Captain Alia Ramirez stood at the central podium, her hands clasped behind her back, her gaze locked on the wide, curved display showing the predicted entry paths of the Velar fleet. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm but stripped of all illusion. We are no longer intercepting projections. Their lead vessels will breach the outer threshold in 17 hours. Full cloaking holds. No weapons fire unless we're painted first. And if they do fire, we don't flinch. We prove why we're still here. Her crew responded not with cheers, but with nods and glances and a quiet readiness that spoke of training without delusion. These were not conquerors. They were custodians. Elsewhere in the system, remote drones woven into the Kuiper infrastructure began realigning. Cold-forged satellites constructed in deep lunar foundries activated their thermal decoys, scattering heat signatures to confuse incoming scans. On Neptune's largest moon, Triton, a series of buried particle accelerators spun up emergency pulses, ready to sling debris at relativistic speeds into any vessel that attempted to slingshot around its gravity well. Humanity had never mastered faster-than-light travel, but it had learned how to make the most of terrain, timing, and a kind of ruthless adaptation born not from conquest, but from survival. For decades, Earth had assumed its wars were over, that conflict would come in the form of climate, or ideology, or scarcity, but now the species faced a new calculus. One that measured victory not in territory, but in continuity, not in dominance, but in preservation. And though they did not know it yet, the Velari would soon learn the one truth that had defined humanity since the dawn of its memory. The species that once crossed oceans on shattered rafts, that lit cities from stone and storm, that survived itself, would not surrender a drop of its sky without a fight. The Oort Cloud waited, still and vast and unknowable, but within it, the trap was set. The invaders were coming, and humanity would be there to meet them. Not as prey, not as stewards of weakness, but as the unyielding, improbable answer to a question no one thought would be asked. What happens when a planet fights for its right to be left alone? Section 5. First Contact, First Fire. When the leading edge of the Velar fleet breached the outer limits of the Oort Cloud, the stars behind them dimmed, not from light occlusion, but from the warping of background radiation as their singularity drives dispersed exotic particles into space like a wake of invisible oil. The physics were elegant and horrifying, proof of a civilization that had solved gravity in ways humanity barely theorized, yet used that knowledge with the blunt force logic of species-level survival. The first vessel, sleek, obsidian, and shaped like an extended blade bent inward at the tip, slowed its velocity with spatial shearing, not propulsion, as if carving a hole in inertia itself. Captain Alia Ramirez watched the telemetry flow across her command interface, every value absurd and undeniable. Mass displacement in the megaton range. Energy output sufficient to boil oceans. Gravitational signature coherent enough to bend local drift trajectories across kilometers. This was not a scout. It was a weapon with a conscience. She gave the order, "Open the hail." A sphere of modulated electromagnetic language, laced with phoneme constructs, quantum-encoded empathy tags, and mathematical baseline sequences, pulsed outward toward the Velar vessel. Behind the transmission were images. Children drinking from cupped hands, clouds spilling rain on verdant fields, ice melting on mountaintops, desalination plants churning survival from salt and sunlight. Not propaganda, not threat. Just proof that water, to humans, was more than utility. It was memory, ritual rhythm, home. The Velar did not reply with words. Instead, from the center mass of their vanguard ship, a column of kinetic spears launched with no propulsion flare, 30 rods of dense, accelerated alloy moving at fractional light speed. Invisible until the Caspian Crown's defense systems caught the breach with a thermal bloom warning too late to intercept. 3 rods slammed into a shielded asteroid station positioned as a decoy, vaporizing a half-kilometer of solid rock into crystalline dust. Another 2 passed, so close to the Crown that its rear plating melted at the atomic level from the wake pressure. The message was clear. Humanity's caution, its civility, its invitation to speak. It was meaningless to a species that viewed delay as death and communication as luxury. The Velari had interpreted the signal not as a gesture of peace, but as confirmation that the prey had not yet evolved to resist. Captain Ramirez didn't blink. She didn't curse or shout or ask for permission. Her crew was already moving, already routing power to defensive shells and maneuvering jets, already loading the fusion warheads into their spinal launch arrays. But Ramirez gave the only command that mattered. Answer them. The Namaka's rage, previously cloaked within a slowly rotating comet fragment, fired a directed energy beam so tightly packed that it passed through the vacuum like a surgical blade. It struck the tip of the Velar lead ship, slicing through the atmospheric intake housing and detonating the particle collector inside, which ignited with a flash that shimmered across 100,000 kilometers of void. Seconds later, the Helios fall lit up space with a pulse burst that turned a smaller Velar support ship into a prism of scattering hull fragments, tumbling silently through the dark. The Caspian Crown, though damaged, deployed its onboard AI pilot module to calculate a micro-jump that flipped it laterally around the Velar vanguard, slinging its anti-kinetic mines into their rear formation with a precision born from desperation. Then came the silence again, not because it was over, but because this at last was understood by both sides as war. No more signals, no more hesitation, only action and fire, and the cold calculus of survival rewritten not in symbols, but in trajectories and yields. The Oort Cloud, long a whisper in Earth's history books, had become a battlefield, and humanity, for the first time in generations, was not reacting, it was deciding. Section 6. The Battle in the Dark Ice. There's a kind of silence in the Oort Cloud that defies sound. Not the absence of noise, but the total evacuation of meaning for vibration. The way ancient ice absorbs light and motion until even explosions feel distant and muted, as if time itself resists acknowledging what is happening. Within that stillness, human vessels moved like phantoms, dancing between gravity wells and comet trails, their burn signatures masked by cryobaffles and their pulse engines throttled to blend with the drifting debris. And in that darkness, war became a choreography of extinction and endurance. The Helios Fall led a lateral assault through a belt of irregular ice fragments, using them as both shield and camouflage, firing bursts of photonic torpedoes laced with polarized EMP fields designed not to destroy, but to blind. As Velar ships recalibrated their sensors, the Namaka's rage emerged behind them, its railguns spinning up with a deep magnetic hum that crackled through its superstructure like the roar of a held breath. A salvo of magnetically accelerated cryo shards, each the size of a fuel container and cooled to near absolute zero, tore through the outer skin of the nearest Velar cruiser, sending geysers of silicate mist into the void. But the Velari adapted quickly. Their vessels, built with flexible internal geometries, reconfigured themselves mid-flight, folding parts of their own hull inward to redirect internal coolant into external plating, converting damage into temporary reinforcement. Their counterattack was brutal and precise. One Velar destroyer deployed a gravitational shear wave, a localized field burst that twisted space-time into a rippling lens, shattering the gyroscopic stability of the human ship Kuan Yin's blade, which tumbled into a frozen asteroid and atomized on impact. In the command core of the Caspian Crown, Captain Alia Ramirez stood amid a cascade of alert signals, her ship's systems buckling under repeated impacts. Their primary reactor was venting heat in a plume the size of a city, drawing enemy fire like a beacon, and their escape trajectory was compromised, but she did not order retreat. Instead, she initiated a manual override to the ship's memory burst capsule, an old diplomatic tool designed to project human culture into deep space in case of total annihilation. With trembling fingers and a voice recorded not for allies, but for enemies, she began. If you hear this, then know we did not fight for territory or dominance. We fought for rain, for rivers, for the way children laugh when lightning splits the sky and thunder follows like a drumbeat of wonder. She overlaid the message with visuals, flooded rice terraces glinting under sunrise, coral reefs pulsing with life, polar bears leaping across shrinking ice sheets, engineers recycling wastewater into drinkable fountains. Her voice cracked, but did not break as she ended the transmission. This is not conquest. This is guardianship, and if we fall, let that echo mean something. Then she locked course with the nearest Velar command cruiser, aimed the Crown's forward core directly at its central processing column, and disengaged all safeties. The ship accelerated, not cleanly, not symmetrically, but with the rage of a species that had learned to sacrifice not out of tradition, but out of the raw and unyielding truth that some things were too precious to surrender. When the Caspian Crown struck, it did not detonate. Instead, it folded itself into the Velar cruiser at relativistic velocity, compressing mass, energy, and memory into a singularity of cause. The resulting implosion rippled through the surrounding ice field, distorting gravitational harmonics so violently that 3 Velar ships lost vector control and spun into the dark. Silence followed, but not the silence of victory. This was the silence of a moment paused. A pause the Velari had never expected, because for the first time, they had not just faced resistance. They had faced meaning, and for the first time, they had to ask themselves whether their thirst was worth the price of trying to extinguish it with fire. Section 7. Their thirst are fire. There are moments in war that do not feel like escalation, but like transition, where the conflict shifts from movement and maneuver to something colder, heavier, and more intimate, like a truth spoken too late to stop what follows. In the wake of the Caspian Crown's sacrifice, a hesitation rippled through the Velar formation, not from fear or confusion, but from a crack in their logic, a pause introduced by emotion. that most unpredictable of variables. For a species evolved to consume and calculate, the sudden presence of memory, human memory, messy and unsorted and wrapped in love and loss, struck like an anomaly inside their cognition lattices. Some ships withdrew slightly from the front line, realigning to defensive postures. Others paused weapons fire entirely, as if awaiting new orders, but at the heart of their fleet, the command unit known as Kevel Thriss Prime issued a hard override, reasserting dominance through signal compression and fleet-binding recursion pulses. Emotion, it signaled, was irrelevant. Water remained the objective, and the path forward was unchanged. But humanity had also changed. The Argo Shield line had not come to this battlefield expecting mercy. It had come prepared to survive the impossible. And with the Velar formation reconfiguring for renewed assault, Admiral Ren Liao of the Helios Fall gave the order that activated Earth's most closely guarded strategic weapon, Project Saltstorm. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was not a beam or a missile or a fleet of autonomous drones. It was a maneuver, a reshaping of the battlefield itself, made possible by months of pre-placed infrastructure and decades of deep space resource harvesting. At Admiral Liao's command, gravitational pin array drones hidden among the drifting debris field released their tethers, initiating a cascade of artificial orbit fractures across an arc spanning nearly 4 million kilometers. From this arc came ice, not in snowflake or hailstone, but in moonlet, shattered bodies of ancient frozen matter harvested from the outer belt and seeded with hypercooled sodium, nitrogen-laced crystal structures, and unstable isotopes. Each fragment had been laced with a microwarp node, just powerful enough to cause a brief, localized spatial dilation. When these warped chunks of weaponized ice were activated, they did not travel. They translated, appearing dozens of kilometers away in randomized intervals, impossible to track and impossible to fully dodge. To the Velari, it was chaos in physical form. Chunks of matter began appearing inside their formation. One inside the intake of a coolant tower, another ripping through a rotating habitat ring, another erupting from the deck of a destroyer and punching clean through its lower hull. What made it worse was the nature of the materials themselves. The sodium-laced ice, once exposed to the Velari's hydrated systems, triggered violent chemical reactions, overloading the internal temperature regulators they had relied on to maintain their thermal balance in space. Their ships, designed to channel water like a vascular network, began to choke on their own architecture. One vessel vented its internal coolant reservoirs in a desperate attempt to stabilize, only to find the vapor crystallizing against the hull, forming a kind of ice tumor that destabilized its inertial dampeners. Another ignited from the inside as its primary intake system reacted violently with the sodium particles in its containment bay. And amidst it all, the Helios Fall moved like a phantom, silent, precise, and unyielding. Admiral Liao's crew worked in absolute coordination, shifting the vessel's gravitational anchor points to slip between enemy fire and redirect kinetic strikes back into the flanks of the confused Velar formation. In a single 15-minute window, the tide turned, not because the humans had superior firepower, but because they understood something the Velari never had to consider: terrain. They had shaped the battlefield before the enemy even knew it was won. They had turned distance into weapon, turned ice into knife, turned silence into storm. And for the first time in the campaign, a Velar ship transmitted a message back to its command carrier. Not data, not tactical repositioning, but a single, staggering statement. They have made the void inhospitable. Still, the central Velar directive remained. Earth's water remained unclaimed, and the battle was not over. But in the heart of the darkness, amid exploding moonlets and ghost-like human warcraft, the invaders had begun to understand what it meant to thirst for something, and to be met not with pity, not with weakness, but with fire. Section 8. the floodgate turns. When the Helios fall broke formation and curved through the outer Kuiper belt, trailing ionized wake residue and molten scars across its hull, Admiral Ren Liao initiated what would later be recorded as one of the most elegant offensive maneuvers in post-Earth orbital warfare. It began not with an attack, but with a retreat, not in failure, but an invitation. The Velar fleet, rattled but not broken, saw the Helios fall's vector as weakness. A wounded flagship spiraling toward the denser region of icy planetoids and fractured crustal bodies near Haumea's orbital shell. Their forward fleet, bolstered by reinforcement units accelerating from the rear, shifted course with cold precision, bending space-time through pulse-driven singularity wells to close the distance in a matter of minutes. They had no idea they were being pulled into a snare older than their arrival. Project Saltstorm had been only the first phase. The next, codenamed Floodgate, had been in motion for over a decade, a defensive net woven not from steel and plasma, but from prediction, terrain manipulation, and environmental reprogramming. When a Helios fall entered the outer perimeter of the Kuiper trap, dozens of dormant mining platforms, once used to extract frozen volatiles and metallic hydrogen, activated in sequence. Each station detonated its mooring lines, releasing cryo-hardened ice bodies laced with sodium borohydride and embedded gravitic pulsars. These moonlets, shaped like shattered shields, jagged and radiant under distant starlight, drifted outward with slow inevitability, then activated their internal nodes, launching themselves in randomized arcs through the Velar formation. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Velari, used to controlling engagements through singularity shaping and clean vector warfare, suddenly found themselves fighting not humans, but the environment itself. Spatial distortion fields meant to catch incoming projectiles became liabilities as moonlets emerged inside their distortions, collapsing containment and initiating secondary implosions. One carrier-class Velar ship, having detected what it assumed was a low-mass obstacle, engaged its fusion lance only to watch the projectile split mid-strike, its outer layer peeling away to reveal a dense core of subcritical fission material. The resulting explosion did not destroy the ship outright, but it severed its communication spine and crippled its internal gravity arrays. Another cruiser, attempting to reroute around the asteroid debris field, ran directly into a cloaked mining rig's auto-defense node, an archaic railgun that, despite being decades out of date, still fired slugs capable of punching clean through starship armor at hypervelocity. Admiral Liao's voice rang across the comms, not with bravado, but with clarity. They think water is all we are, but they've never seen what happens when a species turns survival into geometry. From the bridge of the Helios fall, tactical overlays updated in real time. Velar formations breaking apart, their retreat vectors colliding with one another, confusion rippling through their ranks like static across a dying signal. But it was not just destruction. It was transformation. The Velari, so sure of their technological superiority, so certain that desperation justified domination, were being forced into a revelation they had never prepared for. That Earth, so blue and unassuming in its distant spiral arm, had evolved not in ignorance, but in adaptation, and that its defenders carried not only weapons, but memory, imagination, and the capacity to reshape the battlefield before it ever began. Yet Admiral Liao knew the cost. Even as their tactics succeeded, hulls ruptured, engines overheated, cryovaults destabilized. Human losses were rising. They were winning, but barely, and they could not fight like this forever. So she initiated the final phase of the maneuver. She opened the forward comms relay and began broadcasting. Not to Earth, not to the other ships, but directly into the Velar fleet's command architecture, inserting the message into their recursive feedback networks where it would echo across every vessel. You came for water, but what you found was meaning, and you are not ready to carry what we keep. It was not a threat. It was an offering, because even here, even now, amid the carnage and ruin of shattered ice and broken ships, there remained the possibility of retreat, of recognition, of choice. The floodgate had turned, and Earth had made itself known, not as a resource, but as a world worth defending and a people unwilling to evaporate under the thirst of others. Section 9. Earth is not a reservoir. As the Helios fall held position within the wake of its orchestrated ambush, drifting amidst frozen wreckage and the scorched trails of shattered moonlets, the battlefield fell into a rare and temporary equilibrium, a lull not born of surrender, but of uncertainty. The Velar fleet, once seamless and singular in purpose, now orbited in fragmented spirals, their ships repositioning in erratic patterns, their formation discipline eroded by shock and confusion. Yet they did not flee. Their hunger still burned, but so now did doubt. At the heart of the Namaka's rage, buried in a quantum-insulated chamber deep below the ship's command deck, a secure diplomatic relay spun to life, its emitter arrays drawing power not from the ship's primary grid, but from a self-contained reserve hardwired for a single purpose: transmission without expectation of reply. Inside that chamber stood Marshal Aaron Kell, Earth's acting diplomatic attaché to the Argo Shield Line, a man who had once negotiated trade treaties with Europa's undersea colonies and disarmament pacts between the last orbital nation-states. Now, he would speak to a species that had never sent a message, never asked a question, never paused long enough to wonder what it was truly consuming. His message, layered in harmonic structure and symbolic resonance, translated not only into language, but into sensation. Patterns of atmospheric tension, rhythm structures mimicking rainfall, photonic pulses mimicking Earth's water cycles as seen from orbit, and then, embedded within that sensory stream, came his voice. You have scanned our oceans, our clouds, our ice. You know the volume. You know the chemical ratios, but you do not know what we have built beneath that water, nor what we remember when it falls. His tone, measured and unflinching, carried none of the fear that had once crept into humanity's early communications with the unknown. Instead, it carried weight, the weight of a civilization that had learned to treasure what it could not replicate. You call this a reservoir. We call it memory. Rain is not a substance here. It is a season, a metaphor, a teacher, and we do not give it lightly. Not because we are selfish, but because we have earned it. A pause, long and deliberate, time to human breath and velar frequency latency. And if you take it, if you tear it from sky and stone and bone, you will not inherit life. You will inherit absence. The message was transmitted in all directions, targeting the Velar's command lattice. What humanity did not expect, what no one had dared hope, was that the Velari would respond, not through words, but through withdrawal of fire. Their offensive formations collapsed into non-aggressive orbits. Targeting locks disengaged. Rail pulse discharges ceased. The gravitational wake fields of their largest cruisers recalibrated for stabilization rather than acceleration, and across one of the final surviving primary command ships, a vessel designated by tactical AI as Echelon Core 2, a return signal burst into the void. It was brief, it was simple, and it bore only one phrase: you define what we could not. There was no apology, there was no surrender, but there was understanding. Within the Argo Shield Line, human crews wept in their acceleration chairs, not from victory, but from the cessation of inevitability. The machines powered down their tracking systems. Medics rushed to frozen compartments. Names of the fallen echoed across encrypted channels, read not in mourning yet, but in respect. Aboard the Helios Fall, Admiral Rin Liao exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. She turned to her command crew and spoke the words that would later be carved into the monument of quiet resistance orbiting Neptune. We did not win because we fought. We won because we remembered why. In the silence that followed, Earth's skies remained untouched. its oceans unboiled, its memory unbroken. Because in that single moment of restraint, humanity had chosen not only survival, but clarity. Section 10. The Retreat of the Thirsted. The retreat of the Velar fleet did not begin with a declaration, nor with a formal signal of ceasefire. It began with movement, the quiet, deliberate unraveling of formation lines once coiled in anticipation, now loosening like breath released after generations held tight. One by one, their vessels turned away from Earth's orbital plane, shifting mass around singularity cores and initiating FTL shears that fractured local space-time with flickers of violet-blue ionization, as if the stars themselves were being folded and stitched closed behind them. No pursuit orders were issued, no weapons tracked their backs. The Argo Shield line held position across the Oort perimeter like monuments of refusal, scarred and burning and bleeding, but intact. Humanity did not need to chase them. The message had been delivered, the response received. The war, brief as it had been, now existed more as memory than event. On board the Namaka's Rage, Marshal Aaron Kell stood in the observation chamber, watching the final gravitic wave signatures ripple away through the stars. He did not smile. There was no triumph in the expression on his face, only a grave recognition that they had been minutes, perhaps even seconds, from losing something no weapon could ever recover. Earth had not just defended its water, it had defended its meaning. Aboard the Helios Fall, Admiral Ren Liao convened the remaining captains in a multi-ship encrypted session. Their faces, exhausted and drawn, flickered across the curved hollow sphere like ghosts too stubborn to fade. She said nothing for a long while. Then, as if unsealing her final reservoir of energy, she leaned forward and spoke the only words anyone could hear without breaking. We held. That was it. Not a speech, not a strategy, just truth that they had held. The Velari, whose command class had viewed Earth as a non-sentient water vault and whose culture had fused thirst with entitlement, were gone, not destroyed, not annihilated, but turned back, carrying with them more than losses. Carrying, perhaps for the first time in their history, the echo of a different calculus, that meaning can resist as fiercely as force. Yet even in their withdrawal, the Velari left behind traces. Debris fields where singularity drives had failed under chemical stress, ghost signals caught in fractured time loops, and the strange, dissonant hum of collapsed war forms still oscillating at the edge of known physics. Salvage crews were dispatched not to gloat, but to learn. Earth could not afford to misunderstand its new reality. Back home, the news broke in staggered waves across digital continents and orbital communities. There were no grand parades, no ticker tapes floating in atmospheric wind. Instead, there was a kind of reverence, hush across millions of voices as people stepped outside, raised their eyes to the sky, and whispered thanks not to gods or generals, but to strangers whose names they would never know. In Antarctica, scientists walked out onto the ice shelf to take core samples just to make sure nothing had changed. In the Sahel, children danced in the spray of water stations still running, unaware of how close they had come to thirsting not because of drought, but because of war. In orbit, above the Earth's warm blue curve, satellites resumed weather pattern analysis, their data streams once more filled with a mundane, beautiful rhythm of clouds and current. And in the deep space archive of the Terran Continuum Authority, the record was sealed under a new designation. Not victory, not conquest, but comprehension. A single line was appended to the historical log, authored not by a military officer or a president, but by an anonymous relay technician working from a maintenance ring over Titan. They came for water and left with a glimpse of who we are. There would be other dangers, other visitors, other decisions, but Earth was no longer an innocent world drifting in the dark. It was a world that had stood, and the sky, though vast and cold and filled with thirst, would remember. Section 11. Salvage among the ice. In the days following the Velar fleet's retreat, the outer solar system became a graveyard of silence and shattered calculus, a place where the aftermath of conflict was measured not in bodies, but in debris fields, gravitational anomalies, and scattered pulses of dying machinery drifting between ancient ice and atomic ash. It was not a battlefield anymore. It was a place of remembering. The Helios Fall, still operational despite sustained hull trauma and a compromised coolant grid, remained on station as command vessel for salvage operations. Its external lights swept the wreckage with steady precision, illuminating fragments of alien alloy and disrupted singularity cores that still shimmered with residual energy signatures strong enough to bend nearby particle trails. No one dared touch them without shielding reinforced threefold. Recovery drones moved slowly through the field, guided by human pilots whose hands trembled with exhaustion but never faltered. Every new object scanned, tagged, or retrieved was more than a salvage point. It was a sentence in a story too big to summarize. Hull segments etched in unfamiliar geometries were packed into carbon cages for later study. Crystalline conduits the size of spinal cords were sealed in magnetic vaults, still humming with a quantum code no one could yet decipher, and then they found it. Half buried in a cluster of ice fragments orbiting just outside Pluto's orbital shadow, a smooth ovoid structure pulsed faintly in the infrared spectrum. It was no weapon, no control core, no propulsion device. It bore no emitters, no armor, no threat. What it contained, once stabilized and translated, was not data, but memory. It was a Velar archival crystal, a cultural capsule, encoded not in language, but in layered harmonic logic. Something intended not for communication, but for legacy. Human linguists, emotional AI matrices, and empathy translators collaborated for days before they could begin to understand it, and what unfolded stunned them. They saw rivers, not of water, but of light, liquid lattices that once flowed through the Velar's homeworlds like veins, tended by multi-generational caretakers who sang to their tributaries. They saw great harvest halls where condensation was celebrated with poetry, where storms were welcomed as guests, and where drought was not feared, but mourned like the death of an elder. They saw temples of ice carved from comets and filled with frescoes of vapor. And slowly, humanity began to understand that the Velar were not just thieves of water, they were orphans of it. Aboard the Namaka's Rage, Marshal Kell stood with both hands pressed against the surface of the activated crystal, the glow from its core casting slow-moving shadows across his tired face. He said nothing as the final sequences played. Images of Velar children reaching for sky that no longer clouded, of cities collapsing into salt flats, of farewell ceremonies held as the last ocean boiled into memory. Later, when he addressed the fleet, his voice carried the weariness of someone who had glimpsed too far past the veil of victory. They didn't come here as invaders, not at first. They came here as survivors who had forgotten how to ask. The war logs were amended, not to remove blame, but to preserve context. Humanity, for all its scars and stumbles, would not erase the truth just to simplify the story. The memory crystal was stored inside the Museum of Shared Continuum, its contents sealed beneath the Chamber of Refractions, next to Earth's own capsules of conflict and collapse. It would be displayed not under enemy archives, but under echoes of the lost. And still the salvage continued. Teams collected not only Velar remains, but human ones. Fragments of the Caspian crown, long since vaporized, now reduced to sensor shrapnel, and a few surviving hull plates carrying Captain Ramirez's final transmission code. It was replayed once every orbit by automated systems as a ritual, a quiet memorial echoing through the void. Not everyone returned home, but those who remained returned with more than battle data or tactical proof. They returned with perspective, and in the quiet shadow of Neptune, where the stars seemed a little dimmer and the ice a little more still, They promised never to forget what it cost. Not to win, but to be understood. Section 12. The Water We Keep. It rained over Nairobi that morning, a soft, rhythmic wash of warm air and silver droplets that danced on the solar glass of skybridges and rippled across rooftop gardens where children ran barefoot between planters of wild mint and nutrient-seeded algae beds. The rain came not as a storm, not as a warning, but as return. A reminder that the water had stayed, that the sky had not been taken, that Earth had held. Far above, in low polar orbit, the Argo Memorial Ring slowly completed its first full revolution around the planet, its panels etched with the names of every lost vessel and fallen crew from the defense line. Instead of eulogies, the engravings told stories, simple human stories. A pilot's last recorded message to their spouse, a technician's favorite joke logged in a maintenance terminal, a single note left in the AI core of the Caspian Crown that read, "Tell the rain I'm sorry I missed it." Earth had survived, but more than that, Earth had changed. The United Terran Assembly issued no global holiday, no new military branch, no sweeping security doctrine that turned the sky into paranoia. Instead, they issued one initiative ratified by near-unanimous planetary vote, the Continuity Accord, a cross-species preservation mandate to protect not just Earth's water, but its meaning, its symbolic and living inheritance. Hydrospheric sanctuaries were established, not only in natural zones like the Amazon and Antarctic shelves, but in orbit, vaults of memory where water from sacred rivers, shared aquifers, and endangered lakes will be stored in resonance-locked canisters, encased in alloy so strong it could survive a meteor strike, not to hoard, but to remember. On Titan, where the Museum of Shared Continuum now expanded to include the Velar Memory Crystal, human students interfaced with refractive light programs that played out the story of the Velari's fall and retreat. Visitors no longer asked, "Why did they come?" They asked, "How did we answer?" And in that shift lay the difference between dominance and definition. Admiral Ren Liao retired quietly, declining every medal and monument. She taught strategy at a lunar academy, though she refused to use the word victory in her lectures. It wasn't a win, she told her final class. It was a refusal, and that's a harder thing to teach. Marshal Aaron Kell disappeared from public life entirely, surfacing only once to deliver a message into the black. A carefully shaped, low-power pulse beamed toward the region of space where the Velari had vanished. It said, simply, "We remember what you lost. We still choose to keep what we have." Back on Earth, the children kept running in the rain. They did not know the name of the Velar fleet. They did not know the kinetic yield of a torsion spear or the complex countergeometry of a singularity drive. But they knew the sky still opened for them, and that was enough. In the years that followed, humanity did not become conquerors of the stars. They became their curators. Deep space exploration expanded, not to claim, but to connect. Missions were launched to regions where other silent civilizations might be watching, thirsty not for water, but for meaning, hoping that if the time ever came, someone might answer with fire. But also with restraint. The stars, once indifferent, now shimmered with a faint, shared awareness, because Earth was no longer just the uncapped reservoir. It was a story, a warning, a promise. And the water we kept, every drop, was now part of something larger, not just survival, but legacy. Please do press that like button if you have enjoyed this story, and also please do subscribe and hit the bell icon to listen to more stories like this one. That would mean a real lot to me. Now go ahead and listen to your next story here.